She was called Ma Sisulu, Mother of the Nation, long before the nation itself was free to name her so. Albertina Nontsikelelo Sisulu's life reached quietly across the distances of South Africa's century. From mission classrooms in the rural Transkei to hospital wards in Johannesburg, from kitchen tables where clandestine plans were whispered, to parliamentary benches where the architecture of a new democracy was laid. If heroism is what endures when fear and fatigue try to hollow you out, then hers was the patient, stubborn kind, built from caregiving, community, and unflinching resolve. Born on 21 October 1918 in Kamama, in the Tsomo region of the Transkei, she came into a world of hard land and harder linnets. Her family called her Ntsiki. At the Presbyterian Mission School, she chose Albertina from a list of European names offered by teachers, a signature she would carry through history. She was the second of 5 children in a Xhosa Mfengu family, raised largely by maternal grandparents as her father labored in the Transvaal mines and her mother struggled with illness after the Spanish flu. In 1929, her father died of occupational lung disease, pulling the family deeper into precarity and pushing Albertina into the role of caregiver with frequent interruptions to her schooling. Scholarship and grit brought her to Mariazell College in Matatiele in 1936. There she converted to Catholicism and for a time imagined life as a nun or an educator. But a priest, Father Bernard Huss, steered her to nursing, practical, remunerated work that could sustain her family. When she finished school in 1939, she chose service over cloister and duty over dream, a decision that would echo through the judgments she would make for decades. What helps the most people? What keeps the family whole? In January 1940, she moved to Johannesburg and began training in the non-European wing of the General Hospital. It was a harsh apprenticeship. Racism embedded in routine. Dignity pressed thin across the wards. She qualified as a nurse in 1944 and later as a midwife, walking miles to patients, carrying equipment on her head. Care as labor, labor as resistance. In those years, she met Walter Sisulu, a young real estate agent with a restless political conscience. They married in 1944. I had no political ideas. I was devout until I met Walter, she recalled later. Not an admission of naivete, so much as a witness to how love can widen one's horizon. The house filled with activists, arguments, and the long patience of organizing. Albertina joined the ANC Women's League in 1948 and stepped into leadership roles in the ANC and the Federation of South African Women, FEDSAW. She became one of the organizers of the 1956 Women's March to the Union Buildings in Pretoria, a national turning point when 20,000 women confronted past laws with the rallied dignity of Wathint Abafazi. Wathint Imbokodo, you strike a woman, you strike a rock. The state took note. The state rarely forgets. The costs of dissent deepened. In 1958, she was charged under pass laws and later acquitted, a brief relief in a tightening loop. After the Rivonia trial, Walter was sentenced to life. Albertina's political role intensified in the space his imprisonment forced open. Banning orders shadowed her steps almost continuously between 1964 and 1989, shrinking her movements and silencing her in public, but never quieting her influence in the streets and homes where community life kept breathing. Detentions without trial punctuated these years. The state tried to fracture her rhythm, and failed. The 1980s found her not only enduring, but leading. She helped revive the Federation of South African Women and co-founded the United Democratic Front, UDF, serving as its founding co-president. A vast coalition of unions, civic associations, and faith groups that knit resistance across the country into the kind of solidarity that could outlast police raids and propaganda storms. She was convicted under the Suppression of Communism Act in 1984 and later acquitted in the 1985 Pietermaritzburg treason trial, even as she carried the burdens of banned speech and house arrest. Leadership for her was never theater. It was constancy, a promise kept to neighbors and to the frightened young who needed to see an adult stand and keep standing. Her activism was always braided with caregiving. As a nurse and midwife, she tended bodies and births. As a community leader in Soweto, she tended institutional wounds, helped families navigate grief, and coached emerging activists in the hard discipline of movement work. The public image, small frame, steady eyes, belied a formidable strategic patience. She didn't speak to be seen. She spoke to move people into shared, lasting action. With the unbanning of the ANC and the opening of political pathways, she stepped into formal roles. Elected to the ANC National Executive Committee in 1991 and serving as deputy president of the ANC Women's League from 1991 to 1993. She helped rebuild structures that apartheid had spent decades trying to break, and did so with the authority of someone who had already carried the movement through its most precarious chapters. Democracy asked for her service, and she answered. In 1994, she became a member of the National Assembly, representing the ANC in the first democratic parliament, where the urgent work of translating hope into law, rights, healthcare, welfare, equality, began. She served until 1999, before retiring from formal politics, having threaded the needle from resistance to governance, with the same principle that guided her in the wards and streets. Care is power when it is organized. Her family story runs alongside the national one. With Walter imprisoned for decades, she raised their children, Max, Mlungisi, Zwelake, Lindiwe, and Nonkululeko, and nurtured adopted children as well, including Beryl, in a home that was a refuge and a school for the ethics of service. The Sisulu household, like many struggle homes, was both targeted and sacred. It housed magazines of courage and libraries of consolation. Rising from those rooms were leaders in their own right, testimony to what a mother's sovereignty can do under siege. By the end of her life, she had lived the arc of the century and its reckonings. On June 2011, Albertina Sisulu died at her home in Linden, Johannesburg, at the age of 92. The country marked her passing with respect. National flags were flown at half-mast, and a state funeral honored the life that had quietly kept so many other lives stitched together. She left behind children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and a record that made the phrase "Mother of the Nation" less metaphor and more measure. Where does courage reside? In the great speeches and the iconic marches, yes, but also in the weekday decisions. To keep going to work, to keep listening, to keep the kettle on for comrades arriving late and shaken, to keep defying a banning order by simply being the person you are when the law tries to erase you. Albertina Sisulu made those choices repeatedly, in small and large ways, across 5 decades. The effect accumulates. Nations are not only legislated into being, they are mothered into maturity. The legacy she leaves is practical and luminous. It shows that organizing is a craft, not a moment. That women's leadership in freedom movements isn't ancillary, but elemental. That public health and public justice are aligned practices. It reminds us that the backbone of democracy isn't the spectacle of politics, but the unglamorous, continuous work of care. She didn't ask for reverence. She asked us to keep faith with one another and with the communities that made us. To remember that a movement is held together by the hands that hold the sick, the frightened, and the hopeful, and by the hands that refuse to let go. In her centenary year, she was commemorated as a woman of fortitude, a phrase that feels right, and yet not large enough to contain the breadth of her endurance and intelligence. Fortitude suggests bracing against the storm. But Albertina Sisulu did more than brace. She reshaped the weather around her by how she lived until the storm itself began to dissipate. When we invoke her name, we invoke the patient power of steadfastness. The example is clear. Make your life a site of refuge and resistance, and keep building structures that can shelter others. Then, when history leans on you, you will not break. You will bend the arc a little closer to justice and leave behind a path sturdy enough for those who must walk it after you.